Something is moving on the moon, and no one is talking about it. The impact was felt across the entire planet. A deep, muffled boom, an anomalous vibration that rippled through the underground as if something colossal had crashed into the moon. Seismographs picked up a strange echo, a prolonged reverberation that made no sense. NASA scientists analyzed the data in silence, their faces pale and tense as the reports came in. The moon rang like a bell, but that wasn't the scariest part. 7 hours later, an engineer from the Artemis 13 mission, a 20-year veteran of the space program, received an emergency call. His screen flashed with an encrypted message from a channel that wasn't supposed to exist. He hesitated before opening it, but what he found inside wasn't from this world. An audio file, a transmission that should never have been recorded. The next few seconds were burned into his memory forever. A metallic voice, distorted, almost human, yet infused with something unnatural. "You are not supposed to be here." The message repeated 3 times before the file corrupted itself. The next morning, that engineer disappeared. His house was untouched. His bank accounts, untouched. No security camera captured him leaving. He simply vanished. And the most disturbing part? Every trace of his existence was erased, as if he had never been born. But what if this wasn't an isolated case? What if there is something on the moon they don't want us to discover? Something buried for millennia, waiting, watching. John Wallace never wanted to be a hero. He was a meticulous aerospace engineer, a natural skeptic who trusted numbers and precise calculations. For over 15 years, he had worked at the Johnson Space Center, overseeing communication systems between Earth and the Lunar Gateway Station. To him, space wasn't a mystery. It was an equation to be solved. But everything changed that night. When he arrived at work, he knew something was wrong. His desk, usually cluttered with reports and charts, was empty. His ID badge no longer worked. And his colleagues? They looked at him as if they didn't recognize him. "It must be a system error," he muttered, trying to stay calm. But then came the final blow. He tried to access the Artemis 14 mission database, but his login had been revoked. Every record of his participation in the project had simply vanished. Panic set in. This wasn't just an administrative mistake. Someone was erasing his existence within NASA. Before he could react, his phone vibrated. A message from an unknown number. "Get out, now!" Sweat trickled down his neck. His eyes scanned the room. Was someone watching him? Adrenaline kicked in. He turned and walked away, fast but controlled. If it was a mistake, someone would call him back. If it wasn't, when he reached the parking lot, he found a brown envelope tucked under his car's windshield wiper. No signature, no sender, just a handwritten warning. What crashed on the moon wasn't a meteor. Inside the envelope, a flash drive. John swallowed hard. He didn't want to be involved in this. He didn't even want to open that damn file. But something inside him knew. From this moment on, he had no choice. That night, John sat in front of his laptop, hesitant. The flash drive lay on the table, a silent trap. He knew that once he opened those files, he would cross a point of no return. He took a deep breath, plugged in the device, and waited. There was only one video file. Its name was cryptic. Luna 1976 classified. John frowned. 1976? That didn't make sense. There had been no official lunar missions after Apollo 17, which ended in 1972. No manned missions. At least, not officially. He pressed play. The video started grainy, black and white, with mechanical static in the background. The image flickered. 2 astronauts in NASA suits walked across an arid landscape, surrounded by distorted shadows. The agency's insignia on their chests confirmed the footage's authenticity. Then, something appeared. In the corner of the screen, a 3rd astronaut. But his suit was different. No flag, no identification. He wasn't part of the mission. The footage abruptly cut to a scene inside the lunar module. One of the astronauts was breathing heavily, his helmet visor shattered, his eyes wide with pure terror. He was trying to say something, but his voice was drowned out by interference. John enhanced the audio, adjusted the frequencies. What he heard made his stomach turn. The moon is hollow. Something inside is waking up. The recording ended in deafening static. John's heart pounded in his chest. What the hell had he just seen? He grabbed his phone but hesitated before dialing. Who could he call? NASA? The government? He was already a marked man. And then came the worst part. A new message appeared on his computer. The screen didn't flicker. No network notification. It was as if someone had already been there, waiting for him. "You've gone too far. Delete the file. Forget what you saw. John felt a chill down his spine. The message hadn't come through email. It had been typed directly onto his screen. Someone was inside his system. Someone who knew exactly what he was doing. In real time. He slammed the laptop shut. There was no turning back. John felt his heart pounding against his chest, his hands trembling as he stared at the dark screen of his laptop. He needed to understand what he had just watched. He needed context, something to make sense of that damned recording. But deep down, he already knew. The moon wasn't what they said it was. He took a deep breath and reopened his computer, disconnecting the internet before booting up the system again. He couldn't take any risks. Whoever had breached his system was still out there, watching. He began analyzing the footage frame by frame. The more he looked, the more disturbing details emerged. Subtle audio distortions, microbursts of static within the transmission's white noise. Something was hidden within the sound frequencies. He isolated the audio spectrum, filtering out layers of interference. The distortion had a pattern. It was a code. His palms were still sweaty as he ran the file through an analysis program. The spectrogram began forming on the screen, revealing something that made his blood run cold. Inside the interference, there was a modulated wave, not random noise. Someone or something was communicating through the static. John enhanced the frequency. The pattern adjusted, taking shape, until a mechanical voice emerged from the white noise. A voice that shouldn't have been there. "We have been here for a long time." His throat tightened. He pulled back from the screen, his eyes wide, his mind trying to reject what he had just heard. Who, or what, had been there for a long time? If the audio came from 1976, then this transmission wasn't new. It had been embedded within the recording itself, like a hidden message, waiting to be discovered. John returned to the video, focusing on the third astronaut. The unmarked suit, the strange way he moved. Something was wrong with him. He paused on a single frame. His hand froze over the mouse. The visor of the astronaut's helmet reflected something behind the camera. Something massive, buried in the darkness of the lunar landscape. A structure. Metallic walls. Perfect angles. Unnatural. This wasn't a geological formation. It wasn't a rock. It was a building. John swallowed hard. That astronaut was looking at a structure on the moon. If this was real, it could only mean one thing. NASA had known about this structure before Apollo 11 even landed, and they had hidden it from the world. He closed his eyes, trying to organize his thoughts. If a base had existed on the moon since 1976 or earlier, who built it? And why had no one ever said anything? Suddenly a sharp noise echoed through his apartment. John's eyes snapped open. His pulse spiked. The sound came from the living room. Slowly he rose to his feet, every muscle tense, his breath shallow. His bare feet slid across the cold floor as he peeked through the half-open door. The room was empty, but something was different. The brown envelope he had taken from the parking lot was no longer where he had left it. He held his breath. Someone had been inside. Someone had entered his home and left without making a sound, without leaving a trace. And he had no idea how long they had been there, watching. His phone vibrated on the table, making him jump. A new, unknown number. He didn't want to answer, but he knew he had to. With trembling fingers, he swiped the screen to pick up the call. The silence on the other end lasted for 4 seconds. Then, the same mechanical voice from the spectrogram whispered, "You are not alone." The call disconnected. John stood frozen in the middle of the room, his blood ice cold, every instinct screaming for him to run. But there was nowhere to go. They were already here. Fear surged through John like electricity under his skin. He stared at the phone in his hand, feeling an invisible force closing in around him. He needed to get out. Now. Grabbing his laptop and the flash drive, he shoved them into his backpack while his eyes darted around the apartment. Was there a hidden camera? A listening device? How did they know he had watched the video? His brain raced in a storm of paranoia and logic. He was an engineer. He thought in probabilities. And the highest probability was also the worst. He had been watched for a long time. He threw on a jacket and switched off the lights. The silence felt suffocating. As he cracked the door open, he peered into the empty hallway. No sound, no movement. But something felt wrong. The smell. A faint metallic scent in the air, like the charge before a thunderstorm. His heart pounded. He took the stairs, avoiding the elevator. Halfway down, his phone vibrated again. Another unknown number. He hesitated. He knew it was a trap, but ignoring it could be worse. His thumb slid across the screen. Silence. But this time, there was no whisper, no mechanical threat, just breathing, deep, uneven. Then, a click. Not an electronic click, a gun being cocked. John froze. His brain screamed for him to run, but his legs refused to move. The call ended. He stood there, in the middle of the stairwell, gasping, eyes locked in the void ahead. What did this mean? If they were just trying to scare him, it was working. But if it was a real warning, adrenaline forced him into action. He sprinted down the last few steps and shoved open the emergency exit. Cold night air hit him like a slap, but he didn't stop to breathe. He needed to move. His eyes scanned the parking lot. No suspicious cars, no movement. Or so it seemed. As he approached his car, his instincts screamed at him. The passenger side window was slightly rolled down. John was certain he hadn't left it that way. He stepped back. His eyes swept the street. Still no one, but something wasn't right. He pulled out his phone and switched on the flashlight, illuminating the passenger seat. His stomach twisted. There was something inside. A photo. A Polaroid. His trembling fingers picked it up. The image showed him, sleeping in his bed. John's world tilted. His knees nearly gave out. Someone had been inside his apartment. Not just tonight, before. The most terrifying part? The photo was taken last night, before he had even watched the video. Before everything had started. They had been watching him. Before he even knew he needed to be watched. John felt sweat trickling down the back of his neck. The air felt heavier. Every sound around him amplified. The distant click of a traffic light, the rustling of leaves in the wind, and the absolute silence inside his car. If he got in, he'd be doing exactly what they wanted. But if he ran, where would he go? His mind raced. He thought about going back to his apartment, but he dismissed the idea instantly. If they had broken in before, they could be waiting there now. He took a deep breath. He pocketed the Polaroid. He needed a plan. He needed someone who knew what was going on. And there was only one person. John inserted the key into the ignition, but didn't start the engine right away. He scanned his surroundings. Nothing. Just an empty parking lot and flickering yellow streetlights. Then, he turned the key. The engine roared. The radio switched on by itself, tuned to a station of pure static. Before he could change it, a voice emerged from the noise, low, distorted by interference. "This is not a game, John." He slammed his foot on the gas. The tires screeched against the wet asphalt. He kept his eyes on the rearview mirror, expecting to see a black car emerging from the darkness. Nothing, but that made it worse. If they weren't following him, it meant they didn't need to. They already knew exactly where he was going, and he wasn't going home. 20 minutes later, John pulled into an abandoned gas station on the outskirts of the city. He stepped out, scanned the area to make sure he wasn't being followed, and took out his phone. He dialed a number he hadn't used in years. It rang once, twice, 3 times. Then a deep, cautious voice answered. "Who is this?" John swallowed. "Rick, it's me." A tense silence. "John?" The surprise was genuine. "It's been a long time. What's going on?" John hesitated. How the hell was he supposed to explain this? Who would believe him? "I need to see you. Now." "Man, it's 2 in the morning. Are you okay?" John looked at his car, at the Polaroid in his hand. The panic was creeping back in. "I don't know, Rick. I think someone is trying to erase me." The silence on the other end lasted 1 second too long. Then, Rick let out a slow breath. "Where are you?" John felt a momentary relief. Rick was a former NASA engineer. He had been terminated for protocol violations, which, in reality, meant he knew too much. If anyone could help him, it was Rick. But when John gave him the location, Rick hesitated. "Okay, listen to me. Stay in the car. Don't move. Don't talk to anyone. I'll be there in 15 minutes. Before John could ask anything, Rick hung up. Silence returned. John locked his car, trying to steady his breathing. His eyes drifted to the shadows of the gas station. Something felt off. The wind had stopped. No crickets, no distant barking, nothing. The entire city felt like it was holding its breath. John closed his eyes. Just 15 minutes. He just had to wait. But 10 minutes later, Rick still hadn't arrived. And then, the gas station lights flickered. All the street lights around him shut off at the exact same time. John's breath caught in his throat. He looked in the rearview mirror. The street was empty. But then, a black car slowly emerged from the darkness. He didn't need to see the license plate. He already knew. They were here for him. John felt his body lock up. The black car glided slowly down the empty street, headlights off, like a predator stalking in the night. Rick still hadn't arrived. Or maybe he never would. John knew he had two choices: run or face the inevitable. If he tried to flee, he wouldn't get far. They were always one step ahead. But if he stayed, maybe he could finally get some answers. He took a deep breath and tightened his grip on the steering wheel. He wouldn't run. The tires of the black car screeched softly as it came to a stop just a few meters from his. Then, silence. The engine cut off. The door opened. John had expected a government agent, a cold-eyed man in a suit, radiating quiet menace. But it wasn't that at all. It was a woman. Tall, slender, wearing a dark trench coat. Her short silver hair caught the faint glow of the streetlights. But it wasn't her appearance that unsettled him. It was the way she already knew him. She tilted her head slightly, looking directly at him through the windshield. And then, she smiled. Slowly, she walked toward his car. John knew he should lock the doors. Start the engine. Get the hell out of there. But his muscles wouldn't respond. She stopped beside his window, raised a hand, and, in a slow, deliberate motion, knocked twice. Talk, talk. John didn't want to lower the window, but he did. Hello, John. Her voice was cool, precise, accentless. Who are you? His own voice came out weaker than he wanted. She tilted her head again, as if studying him. You already know who I am. Her eyes gleamed in the dim light. Gray, almost metallic. A shiver crawled up John's spine. What do you want? Her smile widened slightly. You've seen it. Now we want to know. What are you going to do with that information? John swallowed hard. The video. Did you kill those people? People die all the time. The response was casual, almost bored. John clenched his fists. The moon. It's hollow, isn't it? NASA always knew. The woman watched him for a moment. Then she looked up at the sky. What is the moon to you, John? He frowned. A natural satellite? She let out a low, amused chuckle. A natural satellite! Her voice was almost mocking. And since when are natural satellites perfectly proportional? Since when do they have an impossible orbit? John opened his mouth to argue, but the words never came. He knew about these anomalies. He always had. But he had never stopped to question them. Do you think the moon has always been there? She continued, crossing her arms. Do you think it's just a coincidence that its apparent size is identical to the sun's during an eclipse? A chill ran through John's body. What are you saying? She leaned in slightly, her voice a whisper. I'm saying that the moon was placed there. John felt the world tilt. That's insane. Who would do that? Her metallic eyes gleamed again. They would. John's stomach twisted. Who? They? Her smile deepened. Oh, John, you already know. His breath caught in his throat. Because deep down, he did. John's throat went dry. The woman stared at him as if waiting for him to connect the dots on his own. As if she already knew he was moments away from understanding. And deep down, he did. It wasn't just the video. It wasn't just the Polaroid. It wasn't just the message buried in the static. It was all part of something much bigger. The moon wasn't there by accident. It was placed there. But by who? And why? John opened his mouth to ask. But then something unexpected happened. The woman's phone rang. She took a step back, pulling a small device from her coat pocket. She glanced at the screen, and for the first time, her metallic eyes flickered with irritation. John didn't hesitate. This was his only chance. In one swift motion, he slammed the gear shift into drive and floored the accelerator. The tires screeched. The woman didn't move. She simply stood there, watching, as the car sped away. John glanced at the rearview mirror. No pursuit. No black car emerging from the shadows. But that only made it worse, because it meant she didn't need to chase him. 15 minutes later, John pulled into a dark alleyway, his hands still trembling as he grabbed his phone. He dialed Rick again. This time, Rick answered on the first ring. John, where the hell are you? I don't know. I had to run. They found me, Rick. They found me. The silence on the other end lasted too long. Then, Rick said something that froze the blood in John's veins. I know, John. John didn't speak. Something was wrong. Rick never sounded like this. His voice was cold, measured, rehearsed. Adrenaline surged through John's body once again. Rick, where are you right now? Another pause. Then, the response. Behind you. John froze. Slowly, he turned his head. And there he was. Rick, standing just a few feet away, leaning against a car, holding a phone to his ear. His face was shadowed under the dim streetlight, but something about him felt off, something that made John's stomach drop. Rick wasn't surprised to see him. In fact, it looked like he'd been waiting. John felt the realization hit him like a sledgehammer. No. Rick exhaled slowly. I'm sorry, man. I tried. John stumbled back. No. Rick, tell me this isn't what I think it is. Rick didn't answer. Because he didn't need to. John already knew. He had been betrayed. John felt his chest tighten. The betrayal burned deeper than the fear. Rick wasn't just an old friend. He was the only person John trusted. And now, here he was, standing in the middle of the night, waiting for him. Since when, Rick? John's voice trembled more than he wanted. Rick lowered his phone, shoving his hands into his pockets. Since the beginning. John swallowed hard. You lured me here to hand me over to them? Rick sighed. John, you saw things you weren't supposed to see. I tried to keep you away from this. Tried to stop you from digging deeper, but you wouldn't listen. John stepped back. Every fiber of his being screamed at him to run, but he knew there was nowhere to go. Rick noticed. If you run, they'll find you. You know that. John clenched his fists. What is the moon, Rick? Rick hesitated, and in that split second, John had his answer. Rick knew. He always knew. You already have your answer, John. Rick's voice was calm, almost resigned. But what if I told you? The truth wouldn't change anything. A cold chill ran down John's spine. What does that mean? Rick took a deep breath, as if he was about to say something that was never meant to be said. The moon, he began. But then he stopped. His eyes widened. John frowned. Rick. Then he heard it. A metallic hum. A deep, resonant vibration that seemed to come from beneath the earth itself. The ground trembled beneath his feet. The streetlights flickered. And then, up in the sky, the moon moved. John's breath caught in his throat. He blinked, looked again. The surface of the moon was shifting. It wasn't an optical illusion. The craters, the lunar seas, the shadows, they were rearranging themselves like a puzzle coming undone. The hum grew louder. John turned to Rick. Rick wasn't surprised. He simply whispered, "They're waking up." John felt his legs buckle, because in that instant, he understood. The moon wasn't a natural satellite. It wasn't an abandoned structure. It was alive, and now, it was waking up. The next morning, news stations around the world reported an inexplicable astronomical anomaly. The moon looked different. Astronomers noted that several craters had shifted positions, as if a centuries-old error in lunar mapping had gone unnoticed, until now. NASA gave no explanation, and John Wallace? John Wallace disappeared. His bank accounts, his credit cards, all erased. No security camera captured his final movements. No official records confirmed he had ever existed. He was silenced. But before he vanished, he left one last message on the deep web. 3 words. The moon moved. The post was deleted within 5 minutes, but it was too late, because someone saw it. And now, the question that no one dared to ask was on everyone's lips. If the moon isn't what we think it is, then what is it? The end, or just the beginning? You made it this far. You saw the signs. Now tell me, do you really think it's just a coincidence? The moon's craters shift, and no one notices. NASA buries files for decades. Astronauts disappear. Engineers are erased. And when someone gets too close to the truth, they vanish. This is not fiction. This is not a game. This is happening, but you won't see it on TV. You won't hear it on the radio. They control the narrative. So now, only one question remains. What will you do with this information? Will you pretend none of this ever happened? That John Wallace never existed? That the moon is just a lifeless rock spinning in the sky? Or will you wake up, share this story, spread the questions they don't want you to ask, and tonight, keep your eyes on the sky. If the moon moves again, then you already know.